Shadow of loyalty. The battle for power. In the heart of Asturbia, a powerful European nation, politics was a ruthless game of ambition, betrayal, and power. And at the center of it all stood Senator Margaret Whitmore, a fearless leader known for her integrity and unshakable stance against corruption. But power breeds enemies. Margaret's most trusted companion was her German shepherd, Titan. More than just a pet, Titan was a guardian, a shadow that followed her everywhere, always alert, always protecting. Where Margaret went, Titan went. Her political rivals, Senator Roderick Hale and Congresswoman Evelyn Monroe, had tried everything to bring her down. Bribery, blackmail, slander, nothing worked. Then they found her weakness. Titan had a newborn pup, Weller, small, innocent, and fragile. And in politics, a weakness is just another opportunity. The sinister plan. Evelyn and Roderick devised a brutal strategy. Evelyn, smirking. Margaret can't be defeated directly, but what happens if we take away the one thing that gives her strength? Roderick, exhaling smoke from his cigar. Titan, we don't kill him outright. We break him. We take his pup, torture it, make him watch, let him feel helpless. Evelyn grinned, her eyes glinting with malice. Evelyn, let's see how strong loyalty really is when it's faced with suffering. They hired a group of mercenaries, men trained in kidnapping, interrogation, and making people beg for mercy. This wouldn't just be an attack. It would be a message. The kidnapping. It was a dark, silent night. A black van pulled up outside Margaret's estate. 4 masked men slipped through the shadows, their movements swift and deadly. Inside the kennel, Weller was sleeping peacefully. But then, he sensed something. His small ears twitched, and he let out a faint whimper. Before he could react, a rough hand grabbed him, shoving a piece of duct tape over his mouth. Titan, sleeping nearby, felt it instantly. His eyes snapped open, his ears perked. Then he charged. But just as he reached the intruders, they shocked him with a high-voltage taser. Titan collapsed, his body twitching in pain. Kidnapper, laughing. Even the strongest dog is just an animal in the end. By the time Margaret rushed outside, the van was gone. Titan was on his feet again, panting, shaking, and furious. Margaret clenched her fists. They've declared war. The torture begins. Weller was locked inside a cold, damp basement. The air was thick with the scent of rust and blood. Chains rattled in the darkness. Evelyn stood over him, her high heels clicking against the concrete. Evelyn, coldly. Time to see what it takes to break a legend. She snapped her fingers. One of her men stepped forward and kicked the metal cage. Weller whimpered. Roderick, laughing. Do you think Titan will still be a loyal dog after he watches his pup get torn apart? Margaret received a video that night. A screen, a dark room. Weller, chained, whimpering, a gloved hand striking him, a voice whispering, If you don't quit politics, the next one we take will be Titan. Margaret watched in silence. Her fingers trembled, but her face was unreadable. Then she spoke. They think they can break Titan? They don't know what true loyalty is. Titan, standing beside her, growled. It was time to hunt. The predator strikes. Titan was not just a pet. He was a hunter. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just protecting. He was hunting. The scent trail led him through abandoned streets, broken alleyways, and finally, a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Margaret followed, her gun loaded. Inside, Weller lay curled up, bruised and weak. And Evelyn was waiting. Evelyn, smirking. I knew you'd come. Men with rifles stepped out of the shadows. Titan snarled. Margaret raised her gun. Margaret, calmly. Do you want to surrender, or should we just end this now? Evelyn, grinning. You think you've won? You walked into a trap, Whitmore. She snapped her fingers. A cage dropped from above, designed for Titan. The final battle. Titan leaped just as the trap fell, dodging it by inches. The mercenaries opened fire. Bullets whizzed past. Margaret took cover behind a crate, returning fire. Titan rushed forward, his jaws latching onto the throat of the nearest enemy. Blood sprayed as the man collapsed, choking. Another enemy raised his weapon. Titan lunged, snapping his arm like a twig. Evelyn, furious. Kill them! Titan was a storm of fury. He ripped through the mercenaries with brutal efficiency. Evelyn grabbed Weller, pressing a knife to his throat. Evelyn, panting, desperate. One more step and I'll slit his throat. Titan froze. His growl rumbled deep, but his eyes burned with murderous rage. Then, a gunshot. Evelyn stumbled, a bullet hole in her chest. Margaret lowered her gun. Margaret, and coldly, "Game over." Evelyn collapsed. Titan rushed to Weller, nudging him, checking if he was breathing. Weller whimpered, weak but alive. Titan turned. His cold, golden eyes locked onto Roderick Hale. Roderick tried to run. Titan leaped. A final scream echoed through the warehouse. And then silence. Victory and loyalty. The next morning, Margaret held a press conference. She exposed Evelyn and Roderick's crimes. Their empire collapsed overnight. Margaret stood before the cameras, Titan and Weller beside her. Margaret, firmly, "They thought loyalty was a weakness. They were wrong. Loyalty is the most powerful weapon of all." Titan looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with understanding. He had won, but this wasn't just his victory. This was the victory of loyalty, courage, and unbreakable bonds. Shadow of Loyalty, Part 2, Blood Oath. The Price of War. The night was cold, but Margaret Whitmore's blood boiled with rage. The video message played on her phone again, her ally, a senator, executed. The voice in the darkness whispered, "One by one they will fall. You started this war, Margaret. Now I finish it." Titan, resting at her feet, let out a low growl. He sensed the storm coming. Margaret clenched her fists. Evelyn Monroe and Roderick Hale were dead, but the real enemy had just stepped out of the shadows. Victor Dresden, a name whispered in intelligence circles, a former Black Ops leader who had trained killers, built war machines, and orchestrated political coups. Now he had only one mission, to make Margaret suffer, and he knew exactly where to begin: the trap. The attack came swiftly. Margaret was attending a private meeting with her closest allies when the first explosion ripped through the estate. Windows shattered, fire alarms screamed. Titan was on his feet instantly, ears perked, body tense. Weller, still learning the instincts of war, let out a sharp bark. Margaret grabbed her pistol and ran. Gunfire erupted. Men in tactical gear stormed the premises. They weren't just assassins, they were hunters. Margaret took cover behind an overturned table. Her security team fought back, but they were outnumbered. Then she heard it, a sharp, agonizing yelp. Margaret's heart stopped. She turned. Titan was down. A dart stuck out from his neck, his muscles convulsing as tranquilizer surged through his veins. "No!" Margaret roared, firing at the nearest attacker. But it was too late. A black-clad figure lifted Titan's unconscious body and dragged him into the smoke. Margaret charged forward, but something struck her head. Darkness swallowed her. The dungeon of suffering. Titan awoke in hell. His paws trembled as he tried to stand, but the chains around his neck tightened. His body was weak, drugged. The scent of blood and decay filled the air. Dogs, dozens of them, were chained in iron cages, their ribs visible beneath matted fur. Some whimpered, some lay lifeless. A boot slammed against Titan's ribs. "You're awake." Victor Dresden stood over him, smoking a cigarette. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with hatred. "They call you the unbreakable shadow," he mused. "Let's see how long that lasts." A whistle. 2 men stepped forward. One carried a knife. The other held a blowtorch. Titan tensed. "Loyalty is a myth," Victor whispered. "Pain, however, is real." The torture began. The suffering of a king. They started with the blade. A slow, deep cut across Titan's side. Not deep enough to kill, just deep enough to hurt. Blood dripped onto the cold floor. Then came the blowtorch. The flame hovered just above Titan's paw, heating the metal beneath it. The pain seared through his nerves. Titan clenched his jaw, refusing to whimper. Victor knelt beside him. "Dogs are obedient creatures," he whispered. "Even the strongest will break if given enough pain." Titan's eyes locked onto him. Defiant, unyielding, burning with vengeance. Victor exhaled, unimpressed. "Let's see if your loyalty survives when we bring in the pup." Titan's heart pounded. No, not Weller. Not him. A mother's wrath. Margaret awoke in chains. Her wrists bled where the shackles bit into her skin. Her head throbbed, but the pain didn't matter. Only one thought consumed her. Titan. A guard entered, his boots heavy against the concrete floor. He tossed something at her feet. Her phone. The screen flickered on, A video played. Titan bleeding, chained, burned. Margaret's chest tightened. Then a second figure. Weller. The pup whimpered as a hand gripped his neck. The camera zoomed in on a razor-sharp knife. "We took your ally and you did nothing," Victor's voice whispered. "We took Titan and you still fought. Let's see what happens when we take the last piece of your soul." The knife descended. Margaret screamed. "The devil bleeds." Margaret did not beg. She did not negotiate. She broke free. With one swift motion, she wrapped the chains around the guard's throat and yanked, his windpipe crushed instantly. She grabbed his gun, and hell followed. Bullets rained down the corridors as Margaret tore through Victor's compound. Guards fell one by one, their screams swallowed by the storm of her wrath. She was coming. Titan, hearing the gunfire, felt a surge of strength. He snapped his chains. A guard turned. Titan lunged. His teeth sank into flesh. A brutal snap. Bones shattered. Margaret reached the dungeon. Victor stood over Weller, the knife still in his hand. Titan and Margaret moved as one. A gunshot, a blur of fur. Victor staggered backward. Blood poured from the bullet wound in his leg. Titan pounced. His fangs buried into Victor's throat. A gurgling sound, a final gasping breath. Then silence. Victor Dresden was dead. The unbreakable bond. The next morning, the world woke to a new reality. Victor's empire had crumbled. His men had either fled or been captured. His name was erased from power. Margaret stood before the cameras, her expression cold, unyielding. Titan, bandaged but alive, sat beside her. Weller, no longer a helpless pup, stood tall. "They tried to break us," Margaret said. "They failed." Titan lifted his head, his golden eyes filled with silent understanding. Loyalty had been tested, but it did not break. It only grew stronger.